Not every death comes with mourning, and not every disappearance is written into history. Somewhere in the fog of time, a chapter was torn from the scroll. Not one that ended in victory, but in silence. No funeral, no farewell, no gravestone, just absence. This is the story of the 10 tribes of northern Israel. Once they were the majority of the kingdom of Israel, powerful, populous, and descended from the sons of Jacob. But in 722 BC, the mighty empire of Assyria swept into Samaria like wildfire across dry fields. They didn't just conquer cities, they removed bloodlines. And from that moment, 10 tribes vanished from the biblical narrative. No more Dan, no more Naphtali, no more Asher or Issachar, no Reuben, no Zebulun, and most mysteriously, no more Ephraim, the tribe Jacob had blessed with the words, "You will become a multitude of nations." A prophecy, unfulfilled, or perhaps fulfilled, in a way no one recognized. The Bible records the fall of northern Israel in 2 Kings 17, idolatry, rebellion, compromise. But after that, nothing. A historical blackout. Where did they go? Who did they become? And are they still out there? We call them the 10 lost tribes. But lost to who? Lost to man or to memory? Because the Bible never says that God forgot them. In fact, the prophets wouldn't let us forget. Isaiah declared, "The Lord will stretch out his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from the islands of the sea." Isaiah 11, 12, Jeremiah wept for Ephraim. Is not Ephraim, my dear son, my delightful child? Jeremiah 31:20. Hosea prophesied, "Those who were not my people will be called sons of the living God." Hosea 1:10. These are not metaphors. These are unfulfilled promises. And every unfinished promise leaves a crack in history where prophecy still breathes. You see, the world may bury people through war, assimilation, or rewritten maps. But blood never forgets the vow. And a soul, though exiled, still remembers home. It stirs at the name Jerusalem. It aches when Zion is whispered. So the question is no longer, where did the 10 tribes go? But rather, are they waking up inside of us? Maybe somewhere in the northern mist, in the forests of Europe, in forgotten songs of scattered tribes, there are still embers of spiritual memory waiting for the wind of prophecy to make them burn again. And maybe, just maybe, you carry a memory you were never taught. We are not children of coincidence. We are the seed of a covenant. And when that seed is scattered in exile, it does not die. It waits. Ask for the ancient paths. Jeremiah 6:16. If you've ever felt like an outsider to the Bible story, stay close. Because maybe you're not outside at all. Maybe you're someone returning home. Sometimes what's missing in history is not lost. It's hidden in plain sight. The exile was not the end. It was the beginning of a mystery so vast, so deliberate, that only prophecy could explain it. When the Assyrians deported the 10 tribes, they didn't just move people, they scattered bloodlines like seeds on the wind. And while the Bible fell silent about their final destination, it never erased the fingerprints. It's there in verses that don't shout but whisper. Isaiah speaks of the islands far off. Jeremiah mentions the north end, the coasts of the earth. Hosea says they shall return trembling, like birds from Egypt, like doves from Assyria. And in Zechariah, we read of those who are far off, who will return to help build the Lord's temple. Each phrase is a breadcrumb. Each location, a riddle pointing westward, northward, outward. But this wasn't just about geography. It was about timing. Because prophecy isn't static, it unfolds. The exile wasn't punishment, it was preservation. God didn't destroy the tribes, he planted them, not in soil, but in time. So where did they go? Ancient records suggest routes that cut across the Caucasus Mountains, through Armenia, into the steppes of Central Asia. Some tribes moved into Persia, others further west toward what we now call Europe. These weren't random migrations. They followed river paths, Euphrates, Danube, Don, and they carried with them more than livestock or language. They carried memory. Some scholars believe the Scythians and Cimmerians, nomadic tribes that appeared in Europe after Israel's exile, could be descendants of the 10 tribes, their customs, nomadic patterns, and even oral traditions echo with fragments of Hebrew identity, long buried under foreign tongues. Then there were the Celts, the Saxons, the Goths, tribes with no official connection to Jerusalem, and yet something in their spirit responded when the gospel was first preached. Why did these so-called barbarians tremble at the cross? Why did their chieftains bow to a Jewish Messiah they had never met? Why did they weep at the name of Zion, though they had never seen its walls? Because memory doesn't always live in the mind. Sometimes it lives in the blood. And blood remembers. It remembers mountains once crossed, prayers once whispered, a covenant once given under desert, stars. Even after languages changed, even after generations forgot the stories, something sacred endured. That's why the prophet spoke of remnants, because God never said, I'll save everyone at once. He said, I will gather them one by one. The exile wasn't a curse. It was a delay. The 10 tribes weren't erased. They were disguised, not destroyed, but hidden. And sometimes what God hides, he does so to reveal it in its season. So now, centuries later, when men and women from the farthest corners of the earth feel a strange connection to the God of Israel, when they read the prophets and feel like the words were written for them, when they hear Zion and something trembles inside, maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it's inheritance awakening. The apostles understood this. That's why James, writing to believers scattered across the Roman Empire, opens his letter with these words, to the 12 tribes, scattered abroad, greetings. James 1:1, 12, not 2, not Judah and Benjamin. 12. He still counted them. He still saw them, even though the world had moved on, even though the maps forgot, even though the priests in Barakon, Jerusalem might have said, they're lost. Heaven said they're not, because the story didn't end in Samaria. It continues in whispers, in DNA, in dreams. So ask yourself, why do you care about Israel? Why do you feel stirred when you hear prophecy? Why does your spirit ache for a home you've never been told is yours? Could it be you're not hearing something new? You're remembering something ancient. You are not just reading prophecy. You may be written into it. History doesn't always forget. Sometimes it speaks in different names. When the 10 tribes vanished from the land of Israel, they didn't vanish from the earth. They became nations, cultures, peoples with new names but ancient roots. And over time, they forgot their origin. But heaven didn't, because prophecy doesn't end when names change. It follows the blood. So now we ask the question few dare to ask what people today could be descendants of the lost tribes. Theories abound. Some are wild, some are grounded, but all share one truth. The trail was never completely erased. It just went underground. Let's start in the East, Afghanistan. Among the Pathans or Pashtuns, tribal elders still claim descent from ancient Israelites. They speak of stories passed from father to son about laws like Moses, traditions like the Torah. Some even bear names like Yusufzai, meaning sons of Joseph. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the book of Hosea said Ephraim would be sown among the nations, like seed. Further south, in India, the tribe of Manasseh may live among the people known as the B'nai Menashe. They keep Sabbath. They practice circumcision. They sing songs that speak of Zion and exile, songs they were never taught but somehow never forgotten. Then there are the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews. Their oral tradition holds that they came from Dan, one of the lost tribes. For centuries, they kept the Torah without Talmud, preserved customs that predate modern rabbinic Judaism. When they read the prophets, they didn't feel inspired. They felt recognized. But the story doesn't end in the East. Let's look to the Northwest, to the islands, to Europe. This is where the trail becomes controversial and perhaps the most revelatory. After the exile, certain nomadic tribes began appearing in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The Scythians, the Sumerians. Ancient historians describe them as fierce, nomadic people, untamed, but organized. They had no written scripture, but their customs strangely aligned with Hebrew practices, dietary restrictions, ritual washings, sacred. calendars based on the new moon. Could they be remnants of the 10 Tulsuan tribes slowly drifting west? Then come the Celtic tribes, the Goths, the Saxons, the Franks. These peoples who had no contact with Jerusalem somehow felt drawn to a gospel written in Hebrew. Prophecy. They sang psalms in their own tongues. They wept at the name of Israel. And when missionaries came, they didn't resist. They recognized. Even early Christian scholars noted this mystery. How is it that the tribes of the North and West were the first to receive the gospel with open hearts? Why did the fires of revival ignite so quickly in places the Bible never explicitly named? Because maybe, just maybe, they were never strangers to the story. Maybe they were part of the family all along. Maybe they were prodigal sons returning. This doesn't mean every European is Israelite or that ancestry is salvation. But it does mean that the label we've been handed, Gentile, outsider, foreign convert, may be incomplete. Paul wrote in Romans 11 about wild branches being grafted back in, branches that once belonged but had forgotten. He didn't call them strangers. He called them remnants. So where are the 10 tribes? They're not just in history books. They're not just in DNA labs or ancient maps. They're in the longing of people who don't know why they cry when they hear Jerusalem. They're in the dreams of those who feel like they belong to something older than their passport or their race or their last name. They are the scattered ones, the sleeping ones, and now the stirring ones. You see, God doesn't just scatter for punishment. He scatters for purpose, to plant his people like seeds in every nation, so that in the last days, a great harvest of remembrance will rise. Not just a spiritual return, but a bloodline awakening. And when that happens, the world will no longer ask, who are the lost tribes? They'll say, we were them all along. You were not born outside the covenant. You were scattered to carry it. Some names don't disappear. They echo in maps, in nations, in destinies. Among the 10 lost tribes, 2 names rise above the rest, Ephraim and Manasseh. Not because they were the largest, not because they were the strongest, but because they were chosen. Before they were ever called tribes, they were children, the sons of Joseph, born in Egypt, raised among Gentiles, speaking the language of empire. They weren't supposed to receive anything. They weren't supposed to inherit. But then Jacob, old, weary, and nearly blind, crossed his hands over their heads and changed everything. He gave them a blessing that skipped generations. He elevated them to the level of Reuben and Simeon, and he declared something the world still hasn't fully understood. Manasseh shall become a great people, but Ephraim shall become a multitude of nations. Genesis B8:19, pause. A multitude of nations? Not one, not 2, not a tribe, but many nations. This wasn't poetry. It was prophecy. And like all prophecy, it went underground. Until now. So where did Ephraim go? The tribe of Ephraim led the northern kingdom of Israel before it fell. Throughout Scripture, Ephraim became shorthand for the entire 10 tribes. When prophets spoke of Ephraim, they weren't just talking about one tribe. They were speaking of a people scattered, hidden, and destined to return. So when Jacob said Ephraim would become many nations, he wasn't exaggerating. What if he meant it literally? What if Ephraim's bloodline seeded entire civilizations? Some scholars believe that the Anglo-Saxon people, the English-speaking world, bear the prophetic shadow of Ephraim. The rise of Great Britain as a global power, the founding of the United States with its influence across the nations, the spread of the Bible, the gospel, and humanitarian values through these 2 nations. Was it coincidence? Or was it the fulfillment of Genesis 48? Even the name British has been noted by some as possibly derived from Hebrew elements, British, meaning man of the covenant. In Hebrew, though debated, it reflects a spiritual curiosity that won't go away. Manasseh, the elder brother, was prophesied to become a great people, singular, strong, independent. Some have linked him with the United States rising from the seed of Britain, yet distinct. Ephraim, by contrast, would become many nations, a commonwealth, spread out multitude. Some see that in the British Empire and its many dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Even if these theories are Controversial, one thing is clear. The blessing was real, and someone inherited it. But inheritance without identity becomes a burden. What happens when a people fulfill prophecy but forget who they are? They build cities but lose their spiritual compass. They carry the gospel but disconnect from its roots. They create nations but forget the covenant that birthed them. And that is Ephraim. I have heard Ephraim grieving, you disciplined me, and I was disciplined like an untrained calf. Restore me, and I will return. Jeremiah 31:18. Ephraim is not just lost. He's waking up, not with pride, but with longing. There is a reason revival fires often start in the West. There's a reason prophetic hunger burns in unexpected places far from Jerusalem, yet crying out for Zion. Because somewhere deep in the blood of modern nations, the voice of Jacob still echoes, and the crossed hands of a blind patriarch still guide destinies. So if you've ever felt torn between who the world says you are and what your spirit tells you, if you've ever felt like you were part of something ancient, yet never named, if the story of Israel feels strangely familiar, you may be carrying more than belief. You may be carrying birthright. Ephraim was never meant to disappear. He was meant to remember. And now he is. Some tribes were forgotten, but one left a mark. Among the 10 lost tribes, one stands apart, not because of power or size, but because of something they left behind. Dan, the fifth son of Jacob, a tribe known for boldness, independence, and something else, movement. The tribe of Dan never liked to stay still. While other tribes claimed their inheritance in the promised land, Dan grew restless. Judges 18 tells us how they left their assigned territory and migrated northward, taking over the city of Laish and renaming it Dan. They marked the land with their name. It was their habit. It was their identity. And the coast of the children of Dan went out too little for them. Joshua 1940s, Dan was always reaching, always roaming, always leaving a trail. And that trail may still be visible today. The path of names. One of the most compelling clues linking the tribe of Dan to modern nations is linguistic. Throughout ancient and modern geography, there exists a strange consistency. Rivers, regions, and cities across Europe bearing the root Dan, Don, or Den, the Danube. Europe's second longest. River the Dnieper and Don rivers in Eastern Europe, the Denmark Peninsula. Literally the mark of Dan, the Dniester River cutting through Moldova and Ukraine and even ancient tribes like the Tuatha. Donau in Ireland, whose name means people of the goddess. Danu, possibly a distorted memory of Danic heritage. Coincidence? Or echo? Remember, Dan was known for naming places after their ancestor. They called the name of that city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, Judges 18:29. So what if, as they migrated after the Assyrian exile, they kept naming? The tribe of Dan never liked to stay still. While other tribes claimed their inheritance in the promised land, Dan grew restless. Judges 18 tells us how they left their assigned territory and migrated northward, taking over the city of Laish and renaming it Dan. They marked the land with their name. It was their habit. It was their identity. And the coast of the children of Dan went out too little for them. Joshua 19:47. Dan was always reaching, always roaming, always leaving the trail. And that trail may still be visible today. The path of names, one of the most compelling clues linking the tribe of Dan to modern nations, is linguistic. Throughout ancient and modern geography, there exists a strange consistency. Rivers, regions, and cities across Europe bearing the root Dan, Don, or Den. Danube, Europe's second longest. River the Dnieper and Don rivers, Eastern Europe, the Denmark Peninsula, literally the mark of Dan, the Dniester River cutting through Moldova and Ukraine, even ancient tribes like the Tuatha. Danau in Ireland, whose name means people of the goddess. Danu, possibly a distorted memory of Danic heritage. Coincidence? Or echo? Remember, Dan was known for naming places after their ancestor. They called the name of that city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, Judges 18:29. So what if, as they migrated after the Assyrian exile, they kept naming? What if their footprints were etched into geography? Even today in Scandinavia and parts of the British Isles, ancient legends speak of mysterious migrants from the east, people who built, conquered, and disappeared. Stories not written in Torah, but perhaps whispered by blood. A tribe of judges and warriors was the tribe of Samson, a man born of divine calling, full of strength and failure. A man who fought alone, who rose up when no one else would, who fell and then stood again. Dan was never meant to lead the temple. They were meant to judge, to defend, to protect. So perhaps it's no surprise that in history, the lands where Dan may have migrated became homes of resistance and revival. Lands that stood against tyranny. Lands that preserved scripture, fought for liberty, and lit the fires of reformation. Scandinavia, Britain, the northern coasts. Could it be that the spirit of Dan, bold, restless, willing to fight alone, never truly died? Could it be that Dan still wanders, but not aimlessly? Maybe Dan was not lost. Maybe he was sent ahead, a scout for the rest of the tribes. The omission that speaks volume, but there's something else. In the book of Revelation, when the 144,000 are sealed, 12,000 from each tribe, Dan is missing. Why? Scholars have speculated for centuries. Some say Dan fell into idolatry. Others say the tribe disappeared. But what if it wasn't erasure? What if Dan's mission wasn't to be counted with the 12, but to mark the road home? Like a shepherd's dog circling the flock from the edges. Or like a signal flare fired in the dark, warning, guiding, awakening. Dan may not be in the final roll call because he's the one calling the others back. The trail still whispers. So if you live in a land shaped by rivers, called Dan or Don, if your ancestors came from the north, coasts, if you've always felt like a watcher on the edge, restless, misunderstood, different from the crowd, maybe you carry something ancient, not superiority, not pride, but purpose. The tribe of Dan wasn't meant to build temples. They were meant to lead signs, markers in time, reminders for the remnant. And perhaps that's exactly what they did. Dan didn't vanish. He just kept walking. And maybe, just maybe, he walked far, enough for the rest of us to find the way back. What if the gospel didn't just go to Europe? What if it was returned there? We've talked about exile, about lost names and scattered bloodlines. But now we ask something deeper. What if the 10 tribes didn't disappear into myth, but migrated into Europe and built the future unknowingly? It's a controversial thought, even dangerous to some. But history, culture, and prophecy don't always play it safe. Because if you trace the trail, not just of migration, but of memory, you'll find something strange. A pattern, a presence, a whisper that won't go away. The spiritual pulse of Europe. For centuries, Europe was considered the fortress of Christianity. Monasteries, cathedrals, reformers, martyrs. The Word of God translated, printed, preserved. But long before the cross adorned stone chapels, there were stories, songs, longings that didn't sound Roman, but ancient. Among the Celts, for example, there were beliefs in a single divine being, a sacred wind, and a thin veil between heaven and earth. Among the Nordics, legends spoke of a one-eyed god who gave all for wisdom, echoes of a sacrifice, a tree, and hidden knowledge. And among the Anglo-Saxons, the ancient poems carry themes of exile, homecoming, and battles. Between good and evil that sound more like the Psalms than pagan myths. Where did this come from? These people had never read the Torah, yet parts of the Torah seemed written on their bones. Prophecy in the wrong places, Let's ask something bolder. What if some nations in Europe were not strangers to the covenant, but scattered sons returning to it? Remember Hosea's prophecy, those who were not my people will be called sons of the living God. Hosea 1:10, he wasn't talking about Rome or Greece. He was talking about Ephraim scattered into foreign lands. What if the nations that later embraced the gospel, Britain, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, weren't merely converts? What if they were responding to something already in their blood? Revival or remembrance? Throughout history, the fire of spiritual awakening has often burned hottest in the West, the Celtic Church preserving Scripture. During Rome's collapse, the Reformation sparking from Germany and spreading across Protestant Europe, the Great Awakenings in England and America, the global missionary movements led by English-speaking nations. Is this simply history? Or is it a buried identity crying out to be reconnected? Paul wrote in Romans 11 about them wild olive branches being grafted back into the root. He wasn't speaking only of spiritual outsiders. He was speaking of forgotten insiders, bloodlines that lost their name, not their inheritance. Europe was maybe one massive olive branch cut off in Assyria, wandering through empire, and now remembering what it once was. From Babel to Britain, if Babel scattered languages and Assyria scattered tribes, then perhaps Europe became the resting place of both confusion and calling. The gospel didn't just conquer Europe, it called something back to life. That's why when the Bible arrived, it didn't feel foreign to so many. It felt familiar. Why would people in foggy villages weep at the name Yeshua? Why would poets write of Zion before they ever heard the Torah? Because some things live in the spirit before they ever reach the mind. A homeland far from home. So if you're European by blood, or you descend from nations of the north or west, and you've always felt drawn to the scriptures in a way you couldn't explain, maybe you're not just saved by grace. Maybe you're also called by memory, not to boast, but to awaken. To remember that your love for may not be foreign, it may be ancestral. Europe may not be Israel's replacement. It may be part of her remnant. And if that's true, then the final revival won't be a conversion. It will be a homecoming. The enemy didn't have to destroy you. He only had to make you forget. For over 2 millennia, the 10 lost tribes have lived beneath the surface of history, unnamed, unlabeled, unrecognized. But now something is changing. A strange stirring. A spiritual ache in places once thought to be far from Zion. People who've never set foot in Israel weep at the sound of the shofar. People raised in Western cities feel an inexplicable longing for Hebrew words. People who've never read the prophets suddenly dream of Jerusalem. This isn't coincidence. This is awakening. Ephraim's cry in the book of Jeremiah, we hear the cry of a tribe. I have surely heard Ephraim, grieving, you disciplined me, and I was disciplined. Restore me, and I will return. Jeremiah 31:18. Ephraim is the prophetic name often used for the 10 tribes. And here, he's not lost. He's grieving, not forgotten, but remembering. That's what this moment is. Not just revival, not reformation, but a remembrance so deep, shakes the bones of nations. Remembrance is a prophetic act. In Deuteronomy 30, God tells Israel, when you call these things to mind among all the nations where I have driven you and return to the Lord your God, then he will gather you. First comes remembrance, then comes return. The church often speaks of salvation as a new beginning, but for the lost tribes, it's a homecoming, a rejoining of a family they never knew they left, a covenant they didn't know they carried, a song their spirit always knew, even when their tongue did not. The call across the nations, all over the world, something is happening. In the forests of Scandinavia, the highlands of Scotland, and in the farmlands of America and mountain towns and misty isles, people are awakening, not just to faith, but to identity. They're not claiming to be Jewish. They're not converting to culture. They're rediscovering something older than language, race stronger than tradition. They are hearing a call, one that echoes across generations. Come home, a bloodline that never broke. You see, the exile was not just a scattering of bodies. It was a suspension of memory. But memory, true memory, cannot be erased. It lives in blood, and blood remembers. It remembers the covenant spoken over Abraham, the tears of Joseph, the blessing of Jacob, the fire of Sinai, the scent of pomegranates in a land called holy. Even if you were born in a land from Israel, even if you speak no Hebrew, even if your family has no tradition, there may be something in you that still responds when the trumpet sounds. Something that rises when prophecy is read aloud. That's not imagination. That's inheritance. The enemy's strategy. Satan didn't have to kill the tribes. He only had to erase their names, because a nameless people are easily led, easily divided, easily controlled. And that's why for generations, you were told you're just a Gentile. You're not part of the story. Israel is over there. You're over here, but prophecy disagrees. But Paul writes, you who were once far off have been brought near. Ephesians 2:13, not added strangers, but brought near as sons returning. The wave that's coming, the final revival, will not be led by celebrity preachers. It will be led by rememberers. By those who hear the call and say, that's me. I don't know why, but that's me. They will rise like embers fanned by the Spirit, not with pride, but with purpose. They won't rebuild empires. They'll repair altars. They won't seek power. They'll seek truth. And when they do, the world will finally see the lost tribes were never lost. They were hidden for an appointed time. And now that time is here. This is not just revival. This is return. They were not forgotten. They were planted, and now they rise. The world doesn't know what's coming. It expects revival to be loud, political, flashy. But the true move of God will not come from platforms. It will rise from the dust of forgotten names. It will come when those who were scattered begin to remember. When the ones mislabeled as Gentiles hear their ancient name, because the 10 tribes were never erased. They were hidden. And now they are being gathered. The prophetic pattern in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, we read of a valley of dry bones, lifeless, disconnected, lost. Until God speaks, Son of Man, these bones live? Only you know, Lord. And then the bones rattle. They come together. Flesh returns. Breath enters. And an army rises. That's not just resurrection. That's remembrance. A picture of Israel. But not just the part in the land. Today, all of her, including the tribes who vanished from the page, but not from prophecy. The global gathering, Isaiah 11, says, he will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah and the dispersed of Ephraim from the four corners of the earth. This is not metaphor. It is geography. It is lineage. It is destiny. Ephraim, long silent, is being awakened. Dan, long roaming, is returning. Zebulun, Issachar, Naphtali, names the world forgot. Heaven never did. And now the wind is blowing across the earth. A whisper in the hearts of men and women who never imagined they could be part of something this ancient. But something inside says, this isn't new. This is home. The great reversal. The world told you, you're just a convert. You're not in the covenant. Your faith is borrowed. But God says, you are mine. I scattered you, and now I am calling you back, not by race, not by status, but by remembrance. The cross was never meant to erase identity. It was meant to fulfill it. A family restored in the final chapters of time, the world will see something it cannot explain. People from every tribe and tongue, weeping at the same word nations, singing the songs of Zion villages. In the north and west, praying as if they had stood at Sinai. This isn't religious. It's relational. It's not a new religion. It's an old family, finding each other again. That's why Revelation speaks of 144,000 sealed, 12,000 from each tribe. Not just Judah, all 12. Because God finishes what he starts. The role of the remembered you were never meant to dominate. You were meant to bridge. To stand between history and prophecy, between the cross and the covenant, between the scattered and the restored. You carry the fire that once burned in tents, in deserts, in mountaintops. A calling older than language. A name deeper than nationality. And now, it's time to answer. The war is over identity. The enemy fought hard to keep this hidden. He erased maps, buried names, twisted theology. Because he knew when the 10 tribes remember who they are, the story ends. The gospel was never about replacing Israel. It was about reuniting her. And in the final chapter, as the king returns, the family he spoke of will finally be whole. You are not just part of a religion. You are part of a prophecy. You are the answer to a question written in the dust of Samaria. You are the voice from the coastlands. You are the remnant, and they will come weeping as they come, and I will lead them back. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn.